So, you want to save the world with clean energy? Make money doing it? Confused about the economic and technical realities of residential and commercial solar, batteries, heat pumps, EVs? Want the real-world scoop on new energy technologies, not manufacturer hype? Then tune in to the Weekly Energy Show, hosted by Barry Cinnamon. Insights from Barry's 40-plus years in the solar and energy industry will help you understand the future ways we'll generate and consume energy. And now, here's Barry.
Welcome to this week's Energy Show. Now, there's two ways to deploy solar. We can put in large solar farms in remote areas, and those are connected to civilization with long-distance transmission lines to move that power across country, whether it's 20 miles or 1,000 miles. These are really big solar plants. It's called utility solar, and it's very, very popular. It's probably the dominant form of solar going in around the world. The second kind of way to deploy solar is rooftop solar. Basically, that's smaller arrays installed on the roofs of homes and businesses. They use the power. This is unused space. It's on the roof. It's typically sunny. And effectively, in the US, we have, I'm guessing probably in the neighborhood of 5 or 6 million of these small rooftop solar power plants. And then that allows people to be locally self-reliant. Now, we need both energy sources. But when we talk about self-reliance, especially in an environment with wildfires and floods and hurricanes, we need both energy sources. And in fact, an organization called the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, or ILSR, and my guest this week is John Farrell, a co-director with ILSR. Now, John's best known for his research and papers on economic and environmental benefits of local ownership of decentralized renewable energy. That's the long way of saying local ownership. It's basically rooftop solar owned by the owners of the building. He does a great podcast about local energy. He is also not a really big fan of monopoly power in the utility industry. He's one of our best thinkers and communicators on these subjects. So welcome to the show, John.
I'm so glad to be back, and sorry it's been so long.
Yeah, I look back and it's almost 10 years since you were on my podcast last. It's too long, and maybe I'm doing this too long too. But first, just let's back up a little bit. Tell us a bit more about the ILSR.
Yeah, well, for 50 years, we just had our 50th anniversary earlier this year. Our organization has really believed in the ability of communities to take charge of their local economies. So, our tagline is that we aim to build local power and fight corporate concentration across several economic sectors. We work on broadband, independent businesses, waste, and energy. And in energy, what we like to call it is energy democracy, that it's really about allowing decisions about our energy system to be made close to home.
And there's been huge changes over the past 10 years that I'm seeing, especially here in California, where utilities are much more aggressively fighting to kill rooftop solar, to kill local solar, to really enforce their monopoly. And, when I was thinking about what we were going to talk about today, just some examples in California over the last couple of years, what the utilities have effectively been able to do throughout the state. These are the investor-owned utilities, PG&E, Southern California Edison, San Diego Gas and Electric. But they've managed to end net metering. In other words, you can't get credits, retail credits, or even close to retail credits for excess power that you produce. They're preventing solar contractors from installing batteries. They're requiring prevailing wages and special regulations on every single commercial installation, not just a huge skyscraper, but also just the dentist's office on a little house. Preventing schools from installing solar. This is amazing. Schools can't put in solar anymore. Eliminating net metering on properties with multiple meters. So multifamily housing doesn't make sense to put in solar. And this amazes me, refusing to interconnect community solar. Minneapolis is really big in that. California should be really big. And instead, Minnesota is, I think, the best state. And then just even from like the practical standpoint, even though it's not a law, they're stalling interconnections. They're doing this by using ratepayer money to buy politicians. And this is from the governor on down. So I know what's happening in California. I don't want this to be focused only on California, but what's happening to local solar in other states?
Well, unfortunately, the story isn't great. You highlighted two things there, both the way that utilities flex their muscle and their market power over like interconnection, which they have control over only because we give them that monopoly, as well as the political power, which they use our money to do. And this report that I wrote back in June this year called Upcharge really looked at this across the entire country because the story is happening across the entire country. So what the irony too is that California is often a four-letter word to legislators or state regulators in other states, kind of like, well, we don't want to be California. But utilities are really excited to share California's solar destroying policy with other states. So unfortunately, we're seeing other state utility commissions, we're seeing other state legislatures, including in Minnesota, look over at what California did and say, oh, maybe we need to do that too. Maybe there is a problem that we have to address, even though, unfortunately, this idea of attacking local solar is actually going to have two really unfortunate consequences. One is it's undercutting California's clean energy goals, and it will have a similar impact in other states. And of course, it's going to require much more investment in large scale and expensive infrastructure to meet electrification goals that are part of our climate and affordability goals, because we have to replace then lots of what would have been clean local power generation that could meet those electricity needs.
Yeah, so the utilities are using the playbook that they created in California and they're rolling that out. So, yes, on the one hand, even bad things that happen in California start to spread. My good friend Bernadette Del Chiaro, who runs the California Solar and Storage Association, she's probably the most brilliant legislative and policy person in the country. She just came back from speaking at the Minnesota Solar Association, basically helping people in Minnesota trying to figure out how are we going to fight this. And the fight is necessary everywhere around the country. So, are you familiar with the RMI report that they did? It's about 10 years ago called The Economics of Grid Defection.
I do recall this report, and I'm marveling at looking at that graphic and saying that does look familiar.
Yeah, it's just amazing. And this kind of cuts to the core of what we're talking about and what's happening. And when I looked at this paper 10 years ago, I'm like, yeah, that's a very theoretical thing. But now, when I bumped into it again about a year ago, I noticed that it really is happening. This is actually happening to us right now. And just kind of summarize what this paper is. It's called The Economics of Grid Defection. There's two versions of it. But the RMI, the Rocky Mountain Institute, envisioned two paths for the growth of the grid. One is an integrated grid, and the second is grid defection. And what's really amazing, and anybody can kind of look up this fork in the road, this graph. It's really amazing to me that in spite of all the economic negativity of going down the grid defection path, we are going in that direction. Utilities are seeing bigger and bigger profits. They're making it very expensive for people to buy their electricity. And people are going to say, well, I'm going to go make my own electricity because it's so cheap. And where we should be going is towards what's called an integrated grid, where we all are able to share the power that's being produced and power that's being stored in local batteries. So at what point does this break? How do you see this grid defection continuing?
Well, I think, the breaking point is going to be for consumers, because with the sort of the grid defection model that is really premised on the utility crushing the ability for customers to have other choices, ways to manage their own energy bills, ways to reduce their electricity consumption, whether it's from energy efficiency or rooftop solar and battery storage. What utilities are then making far more expensive investments in their own infrastructure, new power lines, new power plants, et cetera, especially in places where we have vertically integrated utilities, and they see that sort of dual benefit when they are able to hinder their competition from rooftop solar. I think there's sort of two ways this plays out. In a state like California, I think you can actually see grid defection be possible because you actually have a really good solar resource. Your electric heating load is probably manageable with rooftop solar. You actually have an opportunity to potentially cut the cord to the utility, maybe not today, but in the very near future, in a way that can really create this problematic spiral down of the utility then having to increase rates on other people as folks that can afford to leave. And it really is, of course, incredibly inequitable too, because the folks that are going to leave first are the folks that have the money to do it. And so the impact then of those rising expenses and limitations on everybody else is that the folks that are left behind are the lower and middle income folks who can't afford the path toward grid defection. But the thing that really worries me is, in a state like Minnesota, just to give you an example, I'm thinking of putting in an air source heat pump to replace my gas furnace. I'm excited about the better climate impact. I'm excited about avoiding, being tied to the gas system, which can have very volatile price fluctuations, like with Winter Storm Uri in recent years, jacking up gas prices through the roof for just, a week's worth of heating. But the thing that concerns me is I'm never going to be able to produce enough energy from my solar array on my house to heat my home in January. The sun is just not strong enough in Minnesota to do that, to power electric vehicles and electric range, all of the things that I need to use electricity for. I'm stuck. And so the thing that really concerns me is that we are going down this path of electricity going from something that's been a relatively well available, affordable resource to something that people are going to have to choose between. Am I going to have medicine this month, or am I going to pay my electric bill? And if utilities are allowed to make the decisions about how the grid is operated in a way that preserves their monopoly power, it's going to be really expensive.
Yeah, I'd like to dive into how people are starting to grid defect in a minute. But in what other states besides Hawaii and California are these grid defection policies or these anti-rooftop solar policies really starting to happen?
Well, we've seen them in Arizona, where they've already dispensed with net metering, and the utilities have already been trying in recent years to shortcut the glide path that was meant to help the solar industry continue to produce rooftop solar, even on the presumption that the prices would continue to fall as the market grew. I just heard from someone yesterday that they're trying to say, well, let's just skip the last 6 years of that and just drop right down to avoided cost rates, 2 to 3 cents a kilowatt hour, prices that nobody can get for delivery of electricity anywhere. Like, that's the kind of price that is at the wholesale level. You're putting power in bulk on the transmission system and you're not even paying for delivery. So it's certainly not going to work for rooftop solar, because it doesn't work for any other kind of power plant either, because it doesn't take into account those delivery costs. And you're seeing utilities try it in Florida. We had this remarkable veto by Governor Ron DeSantis of a bill to overturn net metering, but the utilities there have funded ghost candidates in elections to try to remove legislators that have opposed their efforts to extend their monopoly. They've had dominance over the Public Service Commission in a way that they've been able to raise rates. They've tried ballot initiatives more than once in order to curtail the ability for people to produce their own energy from solar. So there's unfortunately signs in many different places. In some of our sunniest places where we could really benefit the most from rooftop solar, that's where those utilities are really turning up the heat and doubling down on their monopoly power.
Yeah. Now, are there signs of the integrated grid starting to happen anywhere? Maybe even on a county or a municipal utility level?
We're seeing some interesting signs in certain places. Most of this is kind of little anecdotes and nothing complete, but in Hawaii 2 years ago, they did transition the investor-owned utilities there to performance-based incentives. It's a little early yet to determine if that's going to be as effective as they hoped. There was a really successful solar and storage program, for example, that ended up closing, even though it was very popular with customers, and I think was really moving us more in that direction of consumers helping to buy the infrastructure that would help keep the grid resilient, through the fluctuations of solar production and, of course, the challenges that are posed by a changing climate. I think Green Mountain Power has done really interesting things in Vermont, where they have helped customers finance some of the locally based infrastructure that would keep the grid more integrated, still accepting rooftop solar, still having that metering, but also finding ways to capture the more value than they can out of it. The New Hampshire Electric Cooperative has what they call a transactive energy rate that they're trying to use to encourage people to both put in, to sell them energy basically, from their rooftop solar array, or even to use, electric vehicle and to sell power back to the grid when they need it. So they're really thinking about how do they create a mechanism where their own customers can participate in making that grid stronger by integrating the things that customers are doing.
Okay, so let me turn things a little bit closer to home for both you and for me. How big of a solar array do you have on your roof?
8 kilowatts.
8 kilowatts. And so 8 kilowatts in what you're in Minnesota? What city? Okay. So 8 kilowatts isn't enough to capture enough energy during the winter or during cloudy days to keep the heat on. And candidly, I've got a 12 or 13 kilowatt system on my roof here in California, and my two storage batteries will typically still run out of juice sometime, in the middle of the night. And I don't have power until the morning, but I'm connected to the grid. What if you were to plug in your electric vehicle and have that 100 kilowatt hour or 80 kilowatt hour battery to use in situations where you don't have enough power, and during the day just plug your vehicle in at work and charge it up again and drive it home? So I'm envisioning that as being a way for pretty much almost everybody with an EV to defect from the grid. Not that they really want to do that, although there's not a lot of altruism directed towards utilities, but from a practical and an economic standpoint, it would work. Is that something that you see as being feasible in the next 5-10 years?
It's interesting because I love the concept. I've never really thought of it that way before, because I've always really both expected and appreciated the convenience of, like, with my electric car, I plug it in when I get home and then it's ready to go anytime I want. Like, I no longer have to take trips to the gas station, except for in the winter in Minnesota. Occasionally I sneak in there with my EV and I wash off my windshield because, the salt and the sand on the road makes it kind of messy. And I feel a little guilty about it, but I still have one car where I buy gas and I go to the same gas station. So I like to think there's still at least, I'm still covering the cost of the windshield fluid or the wiper fluid or whatever it is that I'm borrowing to clean my windshield. But I think that's a really interesting idea. The thing, honestly, that I would be concerned about is I don't really have a lot of anxiety about driving around and finding somewhere to charge, even though I have a Nissan Leaf from 2015 and doesn't have a huge range. I would have, sort of change my expectation about, okay, so is there a charger near my work or near my wife's work? Would we be able to do that? It's just that I haven't thought of it before, but it's really intriguing to think like, oh, if that would give me the power to avoid the way that the utility is treating me, I'd become a lot more interested in it. We're lucky here in Minnesota. We're still kind of earlier on the solar curve. We still have net metering. Utilities haven't tried big fixed charges. We know it's coming. We've heard nudged around some interest. We've heard some legislators mention some interest. So I'd get a lot more interested about how I could use my EV to protect me from the utility if the policy environment continues to go south.
And the reason why, I'm thinking about this a lot more over the past year or so is I ended up getting a second, or that's the third EV that I've had. I got a Ford Lightning, and it's got a 130 kilowatt hour battery. It's huge. It's a truck. We use it for work. My guys drive around with it. I don't really like driving it around, but it's a great, great truck. It's huge. It's like a flying living room. It's silent and super fast. But it has a 240 volt, 9.2 kilowatt generator output. So it's just like a generator. Well, construction, we need it sometimes. You're doing a field where there's no power. But then I realized I can take that generator output and plug it into inverters and backup interfaces from companies like SolarEdge and Enphase and Tesla and Franklin, and they all have the capability to accept the generator. This just happens to be a truck generator. And then something that actually becomes practical, if I've got juice in the truck or in the vehicle, I can easily get through 3 or 4 days of cloudy winter weather with that big battery. And as you said, if it does become low, I just go plug it in, on the way to work somewhere. But then what that allows you to do is get around the utility restriction on moving power from one place to another. Utilities will not allow me to take my excess power from my house, if I've got more power, and run a wire to my neighbor over the fence. That's illegal. But we can charge our vehicles up during the day when it's sunny, when electricity in some cases on the transmission level is negative. It's free. There's a ton of it. Charge up during the day at work and drive home and use that power at night. So basically we're driving the energy instead of transmitting it over wires. And, there's going to be more and more EVs. It's growing at, 5 or 10% a year. And at some point you'll have a 100 kilowatt hour battery. And, I think the new Nissan, I don't know if it's still called the Leaf, but they're great looking cars and it's got, much bigger battery. So that's practical and completely gets around the restrictions that utilities have. I'm sure they're totally aware of this and they're trying to figure out ways to short circuit it. But I kind of see that as being one future where, in addition to having a 10 or 20 kilowatt hour battery in our house, which is going to be pretty cheap eventually, you've got a 100 kilowatt hour battery that's parked in your garage.
I love the idea, and I especially love how you described it as sort of getting around this limitation on the grid, because in the same way, it ends around how the utility exercises that monopoly power over the system, right? There are all these rules about interconnection, about, net metering, about, exports and imports, about sharing power with your neighbor, et cetera, et cetera. And I love this idea, like thinking about you describing running that wire over your fence to your neighbor. It's like, oh, but you could run a wire from your truck over the fence to your neighbor. It's just that you'd have to charge the truck at your house and then you run the wire from your truck to your neighbor. And it's like, they have no control over that. But what I love about it, even more than the sort of practicality of it, because I think obviously there will be some development before people would think about how to do that, is how it illustrates the nonsense of the rules that we have that prohibit that kind of behavior. Yes, because you have this truck that has a big battery and that has a way to, input electricity and output it, you could actually do something very different than it's been done before. But it also sort of highlights how silly it is, this notion that utilities have been so restrictive about you sharing electricity with your neighbor, when it's actually quite practical. And when you can do it in a way that they don't control, simply because of the benefit of the monopoly they have, we would have the opportunity to explore those different innovative ways of producing and sharing electricity.
Yeah, it's stupid. It's simplistic. It doesn't make sense anymore. And you kind of take a step back here in California. I understand the purpose behind the origination of the regulated utility. The two things that have happened now with new technology like solar and storage and EVs is first, from a technology standpoint, it makes sense to produce that power locally. It's just more cost effective and cheaper. And the second, which is perhaps the most frustrating thing to me, is the regulators don't regulate the utilities. The regulators are captured by the utilities. And boy, here in California, just over the last year, I talked about the policies that were put in place, but bang, 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 the Public Utilities Commission has voted 5-0 every single time against the rooftop solar and distributed solar and for the utilities. And the one law that got through the state legislature, almost with a veto-proof measure, almost, the one law was the one that said schools can put solar on the roof and benefit from that electricity. And sure enough, when it got to the governor's desk 2 weeks ago, that was the one thing that the solar industry was hoping that we would get some progress on. And Governor Newsom vetoed that. So the regulators are pretty much captured by the utilities and consultants. So how can we try to break this cycle? What can we do? Do we need to do some kind of antitrust lawsuit? What are your suggestions?
I mean, I love the idea of antitrust as a tool here, and I wrote about it in the report because I think the lesson that we have from the big tech firms is that we need to be more robust in exercising federal antitrust scrutiny over big corporations in our economy. And I think there's a welcome opportunity here to bring in some of those folks that have been paying attention to big tech and other companies that have really taken advantage of us to look at utilities. There was actually a report put out just recently by a group called the American Economic Liberties Project, which has a very strong anti-monopoly focus across the economy, has really been focused on big tech, and they just published a report on monopoly electric utilities. So there are already signs that this is catching on as a problem that these advocates that have been focusing on corporate power are suddenly saying, hey, that's right, there are monopolies in the utility sector. They might be formed in a different way and approved in a different way, but their ability to manipulate the system and to exercise monopoly power is actually very similar, in the way that like Amazon has its platform, its marketplace where folks can buy and sell, and Amazon takes advantage of that to jack up fees on those captive sellers, to make them use their shipping facilities, to make them use their package storage. It's like, wow, that sounds an awful lot like the utility, where if I want to produce solar, I have to use the utility's grid, I have to follow its rules, I may have to not have storage when I want to have storage, they control the pricing. And of course, Amazon and big utilities alike are spending tons of money lobbying the people who make the decisions about their economic future to try to prevent competition from being successful. So I do think that is a really important piece of this is looking at this issue of antitrust. The other thing I would just say too is we really need to think about restructuring the way the system operates, because unfortunately we all are really upset with how the utility system is working, but it was kind of designed to work this way. Like you have a monopoly utility that controls the way the system works, that profits by building infrastructure. And 100 years ago, when we needed lots of infrastructure built by one central entity, gosh, that made a lot of sense. And right now, it's actually kind of nonsense. There's really very little that we need to have a monopoly entity in control of. It's really just, the balancing of making sure supply and demand matches on a day-to-day basis. That is that important role. And the rest of it, we've already proven can be done in a competitive manner, can be done by customers and utilities alike. So we really need to rethink how we've designed the system.
Is there an analogy to what happened in the telecom industry? I mean, we're here having this discussion on pretty much on cellular, and it's just amazing how effectively that telecom thing has been wide open to competition and technology. How does that apply to what's going on with the utilities?
Yeah, I'll just mention I have a little sort of call out. It's just a one-page section of the report upcharge where I actually talk about the comparison to the telecom industry. And it's almost mind-boggling hilarious to read that like the telecom companies like AT&T were telling folks that wanted to just like connect an answering machine to the system, they'd have to go through a custom interconnection request to do it in order to protect the network for like a safety reason. And I looked at that and I'm thinking to myself, like telephone, like what could possibly go wrong connecting something to the telephone network? Like that is absurd. But we have the same argument in the electricity system. And it's true, I'll grant it, like there's more danger if I stick my, finger in an electrical outlet than there is if I put my finger in a phone outlet. But on the whole, like it's really the same issue, right? Are we going to allow the controller of the network, the utility, to decide on a like one-off basis what should be allowed to connect, or the outcome that they settled on after lots of litigation and lots of legislating and the antitrust cases against the telecom industry was we can create rules about what it is that's safe to do on the system, and if everybody follows those rules, we'll be fine. We can create standards for, what kind of device is allowed to connect, and as long as that device meets that standard, then it can be presumed to be safe. And you know what? Guess we connected all sorts of things. We did answering machines and fax machines and modems and all that kind of stuff on the telephone network, and none of it broke it. Just in the way that we figured out we can put lots of solar and batteries and plug in cars and use all sorts of appliances. Electricity network is very flexible and adaptable. And so I think the telecom industry provides us a really excellent analogy for how we should address the electricity system, which is we need to get the monopoly out of the way. And in part because, as you talked about with this grid defection question, it's going to cost us so much more to do this sort of cell phone model on the electricity business, right? There isn't really quite the same opportunity to build an entirely new network and go off and have cell phones in the same way that and use that analogy in the electricity business, right? It's way more expensive to build your own electricity generation and storage and be able to serve that load 100% and then literally cut the cord at the electric utility. And it's stupidly expensive, right? There's so many benefits to being connected to one another because we're supplying one another and helping one another. If the entity in charge wasn't so self-interested, we could do that very effectively. But the problem is that the utility is always self-serving with its power over interconnection, over grid design, over its investments in infrastructure, because it's all about we make money by investing in infrastructure, so we want to be the only game in town. And if your stuff is going to lower the demand for our stuff and make it harder to convince regulators that we should be allowed to build it, then we're going to fight, fight, fight.
It's interesting, and I'm not sure if I have these definitions right, but I recall 25 or 30 years ago, we had incumbent local phone carriers or communication carriers, and we had competitive carriers. And the competitive carriers had to beg to use the incumbents' wires. And there was always tension. It was almost impossible for the competitive guys to make money. We see that also happening with electricity a little bit, where you've got companies in Texas where electricity is deregulated. You still have to beg and plead and make a deal with whoever owns those local wires to use them, but you can still push power through it. I kind of look at this really from a cost standpoint to the consumer right now, where it's just so screamingly obvious that it's cheaper. Antitrust is an issue, but you just look at the impact on consumers, at how much money they're spending for electricity, that it's just so much of a better way to do it if you're buying your own power and storing it and you're using it in your car's battery. So we'll see what happens, but I'm really looking into the possibility of some kind of antitrust action. It'll take a decade, but getting that started to kind of break this monopoly.
I think it's so important too, because what we are seeing right now is that utilities are saying that the lesson from California is we need to crush rooftop solar. But the actual lesson from California, the actual data about what is making electricity expensive in California is the utilities are doing it because they're overspending on their own infrastructure, on transmission and distribution. That they've jacked up their infrastructure investments, 2 or 3 times over the past 10 to 20 years. And that parallels exactly with where rates are going in California. It has nothing to do with what consumers have been doing. In fact, consumers have actually helped to reduce those costs because some of the investments utilities might have made were actually avoided. New transmission lines, new substations, et cetera. There was enough new rooftop solar put in by California customers that it helped to reduce those costs, helped to actually short circuit some of those utilities' intentional investments to just profit, without actually taking into account what was needed by the system. So I hope that people look at California and say the model from California, they really learned 2 things from California. One is utilities without substantial regulation and proper oversight are going to just run up the bills and run up the tab on everybody by investing enormous amounts of money into infrastructure that isn't necessarily needed. And at the same time, underinvest in things like basic maintenance so that it'll be a very expensive, but still very fragile system. I mean, that's the lesson from California is you have a grid where utilities are saying, and being allowed to, by the way, which is an absolute tragedy, shut the power off because they haven't figured out how to make the system reliable, even though they've made it 3 times as expensive.
And along the way, they're not spending the money they promised on maintenance. So that causes wildfires, literally burning down communities. And when these disasters happen, if the utilities go bankrupt, the state supports them. And then the CEO at the time gets kicked out with a $30 million golden parachute, and they hire another one in that's also making the same amount of money. Absolutely crazy, but you and I are singing from the same prayer book. You mentioned a couple things that I'd like you to emphasize a couple more times. How can people get in touch with you? How can they get this upcharge report? And how can they subscribe to your podcast?
Yeah, well, thanks for mentioning that. Everything that we produce at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance is available free on our website. It's ilsr.org. You can find the show page for the Local Energy Rules podcast there. You can find the upcharge report. Podcast is also available on all the various podcast feeds you might use, like Apple Podcasts. So you can just Google it and figure out how to get it into your podcast app. You can do like my nerdy friend at work and listen to it at 2.5 speed if you're in a hurry. We also have some summaries and transcripts if you're more of a reader than a listener. But everything we do and all the work that we do and the research that we do is available free on our website.
Okay, terrific. Well, that's all the time we have on this week's Energy Show. And thanks, John, for joining me on this week's show. We'll have to do it again in many fewer than 10 years. Maybe in a couple of years we'll do it, or next year we'll see what kind of progress may be happening on antitrust and breaking up some of these utilities. And thanks to all of our listeners for tuning in. If you missed any of today's show, you can always go to the Energy Show website at energyshow.biz and listen to the podcasts.